Henry VI is often blamed for the Wars of the Roses, but the man who deposed him twice, Edward IV, was little better. Edward was impulsive, as demonstrated by his shocking marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. This made a dangerous enemy out of an ally in the shape of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, and led to Edward's own brief deposition in late 1470. Warwick had been on the continent negotiating on Edward's behalf a spectacular marriage for the king with several European princesses an option. When Warwick got word of Edward's marriage to a woman from a relatively obscure family, he was both embarrassed and furious. Edward had sent him to do his bidding and eventually left him high and dry. Warwick now understandably turned against the king. Warwick had turned to Margaret of Anjou, the queen of the deposed Henry VI. With Henry increasingly fragile and delicate, his hopes of becoming king again lay entirely in the hands of Margaret, a forceful and determined woman. But Warwick was her only realistic option. The two hated each other, but realised that if Henry was to be restored to power, and Warwick avenge himself upon Edward for his very public humiliation, then Margaret and Warwick now knew an alliance was not only needed, but entirely necessary. No matter how they may have felt about each other. The alliance briefly worked, as Edward was forced to flee England when Warwick and Margaret landed in England with an army. Henry ruled as king for a few short months, but Edward would return. Edward defeated Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, with Warwick himself being killed. Then at Tewkesbury, Edward won another decisive victory over the House of Lancaster, and here Henry's and Margaret's one son, another Edward, was killed at the age of 17. Edward had been married to Warwick's daughter Anne, who would later marry the brother of Edward IV, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III. Henry himself was then murdered at the Tower of London a couple of weeks after Tewkesbury. Thus, Edward's enemies had been destroyed, and he was restored to his throne. But it had been a narrow escape from a situation that was entirely avoidable. Edward's pursuit of Elizabeth Woodville had been driven by lust, and his decision to marry her by impulse. Had the king been thinking clearly, he would have realised the damage he would cause to his relationship with Warwick the Kingmaker, a man he knew full well could be dangerous to him. Edward had got away with it. But Edward IV did not learn his lessons. He failed to think about the future and overindulged when he had finally removed his enemies. Edward's excessive eating habits contributed to his premature death in 1483, which led to further terrible instability. When he came to the throne in 1461, Edward had been a fine figure of a young man in his late teens. Strong, powerful, and tall, standing at 6'4", which makes him the tallest monarch in English history. Edward embodied everything that was looked for physically in a medieval king. But after reclaiming the crown a decade later, he began to let himself go. He gave in to temptation, eating great quantities of food, and had an all too strong liking for women. Edward kept a number of mistresses, which was not unusual for medieval kings, regardless of their marital status. In fact, it's possible Edward's sex life came back to haunt him. It has been speculated recently that Edward died of syphilis, although that remains unproven. What that indicates, true or not, is that Edward had strayed from the path of good medieval kingship. Excessive overindulgences is not the trait of a good king, and Edward's grandson, Henry VIII, would fall into the same pitfalls. Edward was also not popular in his own time and faced rebellions against his rule, including from the mysterious Robin of Reedsdale. The king's authority was also repeatedly undermined by his complete nuisance of a brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Even though Edward IV remains a highly popular king today, I think it can be argued, when looking at the evidence, that he was as responsible for the Wars of the Roses as Henry VI had been. Henry, after all, was clearly not a well man after 1453, and so has some mitigating factors in his favour. And really, Henry's biggest crime was that he was simply too nice to rule a country. When Edward's father, Richard Duke of York, attempted to take the crown, it was quite simply a power grab. If the nobles at the time had the best interests of the country at heart, then supporting Henry should have been their main concern. He was, after all, no tyrant, and didn't deserve his fate that he met at the Tower of London, a vicious beating over the head. Edward, when he initially took the crown, was ultimately a usurper, and quite frankly, aside from his undoubted military skills, which he proved in a career which saw him go undefeated in battle, he failed to prove himself any more worthy of the title of king than Henry had done. And, as I've evidenced, what followed Edward's death were not just about the greed of Richard III, but also the short sightedness of Edward IV. He left a young son to take the crown. Had he lived just a few years more, which was easily achievable had he taken care of himself better, then Edward V surely would have been crowned king. A king's legacy isn't just dictated by the events of his reign, but what came immediately after it. And this is why I regard Edward IV as being really quite a poor king.